My dear brothers and sisters, today's reading, the first gospel passage and so to the second reading, speaks about gratitude to God and so also about faith and so also about God's mercy. It reminds me of an anecdote of a man named Ironside who was a Bible preacher. One day it is said he went to a crowded restaurant to have a meal. And he sat down, ordered his food, which came. Another man approached him and said, "Can I give you company?" "Surely," he said. So he too sat down opposite him. As the food came and lay on the table, this man, Ironside, closed his eyes, bowed his head, and said a prayer. After saying a prayer, he would again lift his head up. At this time, there is the other companion, so-called. He asked him, "Are you okay?" He said, "I'm okay." "You have a headache. Is there anything wrong with the food which you ordered?" Then this man Ironside said, "I always thank God for what He gives me. Today He has given me food, so I want to thank God for giving me this food." Then the man opposite replied, "You are one of those guys, you know. Look at me," he says. "I am a self-made man. I work hard. I earn my living by the sweat of my brow. I have nothing to do with your God." And then the Ironside said to him, "You are one of my dogs. I like them. When I put the food at the dog," he says, "the dog, without looking here and there, gulps his food." My brothers and sisters, today's reading, as I said, speaks about gratitude. We heard about the first thing about Naaman, the Syrian, who had come, or who was forced to come away, who was told by a maid, "There is a prophet in Israel. He will heal you of your leprosy." If you go back the days of Naaman's time, it was a skin disease, not so-called contagious. And he was a leader of the army of the king Aram. And he came with faith to the prophet in Israel to be healed. And he was told, "Dip in the river Jordan 7 times. And he was shocked. He says, "There are so many rivers in my own kingdom. Why here dip? I can go and dip myself there." But that maid told him, "The prophet has said, the man of God has said, dip and dip." And so he dips himself in the river, and he is totally cleansed. And seeing the miracle work within himself, he wants to thank the prophet, the man of God, for what has been done in him by his God. And we find within him a transformation, total metanoia, total change. He says, "In my kingdom we worship idols, we worship gods. But you hear the God who is the God of all." So you want to show his gratitude to God for what God has done to him. In gospel passage we heard about a parable. It's called Parable of the 10 Lepers. If you go to Jesus' time, the things had changed. Leprosy was called a contagious disease, and therefore they were excluded from all so-called social life, religious life, family life. They had to live far, far away from civilization, far away from countryside. And these men who were hated, who were despised in a way, attitude of these men are unclean. Now how did this happen? If you go back the history of the Jews of Israel, you find around 900 BC, after Solomon's death, kingdom was divided into 2 segments, the Israel one segment and Jerusalem other segment. You find around 2 centuries later, Israel is attacked by Assyrians and conquered. And the men and women are taken captivity, and the men and women intermarry, and so-called, these Jews were now called Samaritans. They were unclean because they had married so-called a pagan countryman. But years later, Jerusalem itself was captured by the Babylonians, and they too were taken prisoners to their own kingdom, and they too intermarried. And yet, the Jews of Judah, the capital, called these people Samaritans, non-Jews. So we call them unclean. It's one of those unclean persons who, when he realizes he is healed, comes back to give thanks to God. What does the so-called today's reading speak about? It's because God's mercy is unconditional. He doesn't go to see whether this man is Samaritan, a Jew, whatever faith he might be. God's mercy extends to all. If you come here in the old Goa itself, people of all religions come to pay homage to Xavier. And they come for favors. And God intercedes through the prayers of Xavier for these people. God's mercy is unconditional. The same thing we learn from is, you find both Nam and the Samaritan who came is totally converted after his experience of God. And third and final thing we learn is, from this is, never take God for granted. Never take the goodness of others for granted. Never say God has chosen us to be so-called His own, but God has to give us, has to take care of us. Never take others' goodness, kindness, love, mercy for granted. As we take part in this Mass, Lord, let's ask God ourselves, do we take ourselves for granted? Do we take God for granted? Do we take ourselves in the sense of what we have received for granted? We ask God to continue blessing us, blessing others, our families, so that we work as a team always to praise and thank God for all that He is to us, for all that He will be to us, and thus, in a way, manifest what we call a deep longing, a deep faith with Him and with each other.